Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Heather Hansen, and I know a lot of you have some questions and some opinions and some thoughts about those questions and the answers, and so do I. I want to start, though, I just said this to Aaron, we cover these cases, and a lot of the cases that we cover are death penalty cases, and I know that people have political opinions and thoughts on them, and everyone is welcome to their opinions here. But I just find it a little bit weird that they're going back to determine whether or not to put someone to death, and they're saying, oh, and your lunch is ready, so eat your sandwich and enjoy your French fries as you decide whether or not to put someone to death, Aaron. But I guess that's just the nature of the system.
It is. There have been a few moments in this case where it seems that various people have been trying to inject a little bit of something, and I'm not sure what it is in the process, maybe to lighten the heavy mood, but I don't know how it's possible to lighten the heavy mood of the burden of the decision that faces the jury. It could just be like those uncomfortable, trying to make something out of an uncomfortable situation.
Well, and I think too, I know from my cases, it's the same thing as doctors. You get so used to the things that you do every day that it no longer seems as big of a deal, and you forget that for the Matos family, they may lose their son, brother, godson, whatever, and for the victims, that this is something that they have lost all of these people, and the weight of all of that sometimes gets lost. I do, because we have so many comments talking about this, but I do want to talk about the questions and the responses. So the first question was something to the effect of how will Matos be put to death in the state of Florida? And then the second question was, if he's given life, is there any possibility of parole? I personally felt as though the appropriate answer to that would have been, you've had the evidence, go back and consider the evidence, and not to have answered. How would you argue both sides? And maybe you and I can sort of argue together for both sides. If you're the prosecution, how do you want those questions answered?
Well, I think the prosecution tried to answer the first one by just saying that he would be put to death in line with the current constitutional standards.
Which is questionable, right? Because right now, lethal injection is
not... Well,
see,
go ahead. Yeah, and look, something tells me somebody on this jury knows a lot about what's going on with death penalty litigation, because someone seems to be teeing that up to question, okay, well, if we send him to death, is a court going to flip it?
Well, let's back up to make sure, because not everyone in the audience may know what we're talking about. Lethal injection has been the subject of a lot of constitutional arguments, saying that it is cruel and unusual, and that therefore it is not constitutional to put people to death that way. And so
and it's also been the subject of a lot of back and forth between the pharmaceutical industry and the state authorities, because a lot of people who take the Hippocratic Oath as medical professionals, it's first do no harm. Well, if you're selling a drug that can be part of these drug cocktails that are used to put inmates to death, a lot of the drug companies won't even sell them to states for this purpose anymore.
Absolutely.
And the states are struggling to get hold of the stuff, and it's caused this big, huge uproar. So it may be that somebody on the jury is back there saying, well, if we're just going to subject this defendant to 30 years worth of arguments, drug shortages, backs and forths on what exactly can happen from an appellate standpoint, then why do that?
Right.
But so is it really the decision that the jury's supposed to be making?
Well, that brings up a whole other discussion. But for the prosecution, I think you're right. The prosecution tried to say, the only answer is that this will be done consistent with our Constitution, which the judge did not do, and I think that was completely appropriate, and that would have been error had she given that type of
instruction. On what grounds?
Well, just simply the prejudicial nature of giving an answer that is not consistent with the law, because the law itself is not saying that a lethal injection is necessarily, the cases are out there that say that it's in fact not consistent with the Constitution to use a lethal injection. So if she were to tell this jury that whatever way he will be put to death would be consistent with the Constitution,
it'll tee it up for an appellate issue
at the very least. So I think that was smart, and I think that for her to say what the options are as of the state of the law right now, which are the electric chair or lethal injection, perhaps was appropriate.
Perhaps was, but I also could see somebody on the jury back there saying, "Oh, I don't want to subject him to this one. I prefer that one," and then they wind up deadlocking over that whole issue. I almost am inclined, and this is just my regular thinking hat, not my lawyer cap on, but to just say, it's not for you to decide that, jury.
Right.
Don't concern yourself with that. Your job is to determine whether or not the aggressors and the mitigators dictate one outcome over another. And a lot of times juries spin their wheels because they struggle to understand what question they are being asked to decide. They're not being asked to decide whether one type of killing, one type of inflicting the death penalty, one form of death is better or worse over the other. And it seems like they're trying to jump into that role.
Well, I agree.
But that's not their job to decide.
I agree. And I think from the defense perspective, for her to have answered that first question, but not the second question, sometimes by not answering, you give an answer. So the second question was whether or not he would be amenable to parole, given the state of the law. And by saying, I can't answer that question, doesn't that really say he could be amenable to parole? I think it does. And if I was representing that defendant...
It could be perceived that way.
Absolutely,
because right now it's either death or life in prison
Right.
without parole. It's,
Right.
it's first-degree murder. It's one or the other. So it's just like...
Yeah, but if you say I can't answer that question, I think there's many jurors who could say to themselves, well, that means that there's a possibility he could get parole, and I certainly don't want to see him paroled. If I were the defense attorney, I would have been jumping up and down about that particular answer. I would have been less concerned about the first, because I think you're right, Aaron, that it's really, it's apples and oranges, 6 of one, half dozen of another, however the
And
person
look,
is.
I mean, it's right. If this were an academic class where we're debating all sides of this particular issue, great. The jury would probably be given extra points for examining
Right.
every facet of
Right.
it. But in a court of law, a jury's asked to decide a very narrow window of information. And one thing that I've struggled with and hopefully gotten better with as I age is to determine, okay, well, what's it for me to decide and what is it not for me to decide?
Right. Yeah, and this is for this jury to decide. But I don't know. If I were the judge, I think I would have not answered either one of those questions. I think for the first question, it's not for them to decide the manner in which this is to happen. That's for the legislature to determine whether or not. And also, I think that there is some choice by the defendant in some states. So again, that's
ultimately that's what the answer became.
Right.
He can
that
either
he
choose.
has the choice. Right.
Yes.
But for the second question, I think by saying I can't answer that question, that can certainly lead some of the jurors to think that the answer is, well, there is a possibility of parole. And the thought of that may be enough to lean some people who were otherwise thinking, I'm not going to give the death penalty here, I'll just see him in jail for life, towards saying, you know what, I better give the death penalty rather than have this monster back out on the street. So I think that second answer could have a huge impact on deliberations and the ultimate verdict in this case.
It could shove a decision one way or the next, but these questions are sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of questions. They're not questions with easy answers, and either one could, in theory, tip a proceeding one way or the next. If there's one juror back there that's worried about the type of punishment or the type of the method that death would be handed out, then being armed with that information, the juror might be back there saying, well, I'm going to say no to the death penalty because I don't like either one, or something
Right.
like that.
Well, and the judge pointed out that the Supreme Court gives her two options. She's to either answer the question or to say very specific words about, I can't answer that question. But it's up to her to determine. The Supreme Court doesn't give her guidance as to whether she can or cannot answer a question. That's for her to determine. And in this case, I think that if I were the defense attorney, I would have argued far more strongly and passionately against that answer to the second question, because I think it would have an impact. But we'll see. We'll see. I wonder that we won't hear some more questions from this jury, but not
Yeah,
till
we
after
might
lunch.
now.
For right now, guys, we are going to take you to some of the clips of the testimony that you heard in the penalty aspect of this case, and specifically some of the mitigating testimony that you heard from friends and family members of Adam Matos. The first clips are going to be from his godmother. This is the type of thing that jury is going to be thinking about in determining whether or not each and every one of them, and as Aaron has pointed out time and time again, it has to be each and every one of them, feels as though they are willing to say that Adam Matos should be put to death. So we'll watch those clips and we'll be back in